December meeting minutes. Motion.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Folks, second by Mr. Coleman. Everybody in agreement? All those in favor, I'm sorry, I've got to go back to my list.
That's fine.
You're good?
Aye.
Aye. All right, next up, Sheila, do we have anybody signed up for public comment? No, we do not. All right, so we can move on from there. The director's report, you've got in your notebook, a couple of things, I'll touch on this briefly in the big room later on, but there are a couple of things that I do want to bring to your attention. We did get our statewide rail plan approved by FRA, and much credit goes to Emily and her team and our consultant partners that worked on that. We have the first story map statewide rail plan in the nation. It's been approved by FRA, so I feel very confident that that would be the next award-winning DRPT project. And I feel like we've been on the road show the last 2 weeks. I've been in DC several times over the last 2 weeks talking about what we're doing for passenger and freight rail here in Virginia. Now, on an international panel and then a Southeast Rail Forum panel last week. So lots of good positive attention for our rail services.
And Jennifer, kudos for the director's email that's going out that talks
Yeah, very
about
helpful. Very helpful.
what's going on, that's going to this much wider audience. It's really well done.
Yeah, really trying to make sure that we get our message out there, what's going on at DRPT, what we're doing. I try to do a lot through my own, like LinkedIn type social media. Mary Olivia does our social media for DRPT and has really upped our game in that space, and we've got some fun things planned as we continue to celebrate our 30th anniversary this year. A couple of other things that I want to mention. We have submitted over the weekend, like the whole agency almost worked over the weekend trying to get our budget 6-year program and federal applications done. We submitted 2 applications for the FRA Corridor ID program. This is a new program under IIJA that for the first time FRA has a pipeline to basically take emerging rail corridors and work them through a planning process, an engineering process into implementation. Where we've kind of done that our own way here in Virginia, now there's going to be a federal path to that that has funding associated with it. So we submitted 2 applications.
So explain what an emerging rail corridor is.
So a great example is Bristol. And we did a General Assembly mandated study on what would it take to extend rail to Bristol. So that's a corridor that's in our rail plan as a developmental corridor. And so one of the applications we submitted was for Washington, D.C. to Bristol. So that encompasses the work that's going on by VPRA to get to the New River Valley by 2026. And then that will enable us to do service development planning work on to Bristol if that corridor is selected by FRA and funded. The first phase of planning work out of Corridor ID is funded at 100% by FRA.
What's the total on that?
It's $500,000. And we also,
respond on that application.
so they were due Monday.
Yes. So it's brand new. They haven't given us a date yet. I'm sorry. I hope you don't mind.
No, go ahead. No, I'm looking right now.
Jumping in. So I'm thinking within the next 6 months. And it would be a service development plan would be the next step. And then we've already gotten started on some of that on our own.
And we've been very clear, Mr. Folks, you know this very well, that, I mean, it's gonna take us a considerable amount of money to get to Bristol. And the legislative study was 500 million plus. I think based on what we're learning with New River Valley.
500 million to bring the track up to the standard that we need to put
But
down.
our estimate now is 12 billion. I mean, just from what we were learning in the New River Valley. So
And how many
it's-
miles is it?
It's over 100 miles.
Yeah.
And it would be from the New River Valley to Russell, not going back to Roanoke.
Correct.
$10 million
It would
a
be
mile.
from New River Valley to
Interstate highway.
very preliminary work, and in order to make
Oh,
it
running
work.
freight trains over that every day.
Guys, let me talk.
20 a day.
20 freight trains.
So, we've done one very high-level legislatively mandated study, and we're hopeful that the FRA will fund our project to allow us to continue to do developmental work. We're working with Tennessee DRT. They've got a study that's due to their legislature in June, by the end of June. that's looking at rail within Tennessee. And to make this work, it's gotta connect through Bristol on into points in the
And
southeast.
of course, that's a shocking number for a little over 100 miles of rail.
Terrain and condition, there's a lot.
And it's not as if there's not a track already there.
There's a single track already.
So then you would have.
None of that has been determined. We have done one legislatively mandated, very brief feasibility study,
Just
and
send
all
everybody
of
the
that.
report, let them read it.
Yeah. We will keep you posted.
How did you come up with a number if it's not that much work to put into it?
It's a planning level number. We do that all the time.
Okay.
Let me do this.
Don't be defensive.
Okay.
Don't be defensive.
So,
Right, you do that, you double it.
Just as a historical footnote, folks, 60 years ago, 65 years ago, they were running 8 passenger trains a day on that corridor. With
Yeah.
track that is there now, passing tracks, in addition to the freight trains. And it worked. So I'm like Scott, I'm just wondering why
Shocked
it
that
would
we're
take that
spending
kind of
$1
money
on that
to,
corridor.
with the technology available today, to run 2 passenger trains down there.
I am hopeful that we will have the opportunity through FRA to continue work in that corridor. All of our passenger rail funding is dedicated to transforming rail in Virginia and delivering that package of projects that VPRA is working on. And so we have been very clear, Mr. Folks and our friends in Bristol, that we need the federal money to come through for us to continue work on development.
And I hope Tennessee will
Step up.
have a positive result of that study, because rather than that becoming a dead-end corridor, if the Tennessee service, then that's a corridor to Atlanta, Nashville, Birmingham, all kinds of places where you get through traffic.
So we're part of the Southeast Corridor Commission. I'm actually the vice chair of the Southeast Corridor Commission,
Good.
where we are working with our neighbors in Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, everything south of here. We have a regional strategy that's already put together. We're working with them. Have applied for some additional funding to look at shared, benefits for passenger and freight and shared corridors, because that's the way the Southeast is going to look, which is different than the Northeast corridor. And so that dialogue with us and Tennessee and North Carolina, I think everybody is really looking to us and looking at what we're doing, because we're leading the way
You're
to
leading
make
the
the
way.
connections for the whole Southeast.
Is that the same rail line that services Tennessee, Eastman, and Kingsport?
No.
No, that's CSX. That goes to South Carolina.
It goes through Johnson City rather than Kingsport line we're looking at.
Okay.
Jen, how do we interact with VPRA on this? I
See,
mean,
that's the CSX.
Look,
That's
are
towards
we the
South.
lead and?
So on all of the long-range planning and the developmental corridors, DRPT is the lead.
Okay.
The way we have and the way we continue to work is when things are in development and they get to a certain phase, and this is where DJ and I work very closely together to determine what's a logical point of transition to hand them over to VPRA for implementation. So any of this early planning work for Bristol or for the Commonwealth corridor, which is the east-west corridor, all stays with DRPT. DRPT is also the lead on the Bedford stop and the work in that corridor, which we're also pursuing federal funding for that as well. But when that project gets to a certain point of implementation, we would then hand it over to VPRA. They're set up as an implementing agency, and we retain the responsibility for identifying and prioritizing corridors for implementation, so that stays with this body.
Unrelated to that, but a question that kind of transcends the CTB and this rail committee, is the Shenandoah Rail Trail. And I understand there's been some, I hesitate to call it movement, but there's been a presentation by the group led by Bill Holzman for the plan, well, in their plan, the dual use of that with a potential restoration of that rail line or rail service down through the valley. Is that something DRPT is involved in, or?
So that is something that we have had some conversations about. Ultimately, you've got a state trails office that's based here at VDOT.
that is involved in that as well. So the Secretary's office is taking the primary lead on coordinating with that, because it does change the cost. I mean, there's a cost associated with preserving that corridor for rail use as well.
Right, I think the Holzman plan would include the restoration of the existing rail to allow rail service.
It's actually
With some type of trail infrastructure beside on the 66.
It's actually the Shenandoah Battlefield Foundation that's looking to do it.
Really?
Holtzman's on that board.
Okay.
Kevin Walker has been spearheading that.
But the idea is to retain certain,
Right.
yeah.
They would take it over. I've forgotten how many. They have tens of thousands of acres that they already own and manage, so they would take this in.
They
they're-
take the rail line.
The line
Wow.
and then convert it for both purposes.
I think it's an interesting
No,
idea.
it's a powerful group, it really
Yeah,
is.
yeah, well, that Holzman's no.
Yeah.
Who do they, I've gotten calls on that too, who do they want to talk to? Because
I
it sounds
would-
like we're not really up and running
Rachel,
yet.
Deputy Secretary Rachel Jones has been talking to them as well, and so I would.
Good.
I would.
Kathy was real helpful.
Well, I spoke to John Lawson. He said that you guys are planning on conducting some study of the cost of rehabilitate. Is that DRPT or is that?
I'm not aware of that.
Must be, okay.
Because they've
They've
consulted with
Your cousin.
engineering firms.
Right, they have.
They're ready to go
Yeah.
to actually
We,
do the
we have,
analysis.
we have not been asked to do anything with that
Okay.
corridor.
Do you want to be part of that?
I would think so. We'll talk to you a little bit later
They've
about
also-
how
they've also- they've also
oversubscribed
tried to
our
get
freight
access.
programs are, and then.
I mean, it's a novel idea.
It is.
And to be able to retain service, it's the best of both worlds. Certainly compromises in the trail configuration, but if you can maintain that
What I've heard,
economic.
that they would have to do both, it would take a lot more right-of-way work. That's what I've been advised.
That is what I have heard as well.
Yeah.
But
And
they are-
I will say, we have no funding on the freight rail side to put into any kind of
Okay.
corridor restoration.
So
which we
more on
can-
that to come, I think. perhaps
which
in
we
our
can
meeting.
talk about later. A couple of other things. We did put a slide in the director's report deck about rail safety. I've spent a lot of time in the aftermath of the situation in Ohio with the governor's office and CSX and Norfolk Southern on rail safety issues. I just want to make sure that you understand that DRPT is not charged with rail safety or regulation by code. That is the State Corporation Commission. So they have the direct relationship with the Federal Railroad Administration on all rail safety related work here in Virginia, but we did have very good conversations with both
Do
Norfolk
they actually
Southern
have
and
rail
CSX.
experts to?
They do.
They do.
They have to in order to fulfill the federal requirements.
So there is no entity within state government that is dealing with safety.
There is the State Corporation Commission.
And what do they do?
There are federal regulations that they are charged by code with fulfilling that FRA monitors and has delegated to them. That's why they have to have the right people in place. They go out and do the safety reviews with the railroads, but that's all done through the SCC.
So they're like
They do
DEQ is to EPA?
They are.
inspections during this
Okay.
report, they do inspections, they
Yep.
investigate accidents, they look at derailments, block materials, hazmat, they do all that.
They do that for rail, they do it for pipeline, that's part of that's long been part of the charge of the SCC.
Do you anticipate upcoming legislation in Virginia to assign responsibilities within state government?
It's already in code.
Then to legislate safety measures? Is any conversation going on out there?
Those are always hard ones to make
Yeah.
Yeah.
a state-specific regulation.
I agree.
You know, those are the caboose laws of the 1980s where Virginia still required cabooses. They drop it at the border and pick it up in Virginia.
I think that's where, you will see more happen at the federal level. I know there's been a lot that has come out of FRA in the aftermath, but anyway, just wanted you to know that we're plugged into those conversations, even though that authority does not lie with us. On the transit side, it's not in your package, but we were notified this past week that we received a national recognition award from the American Council of Engineering Companies for the Virginia Transit Equity and Modernization Study, another first of its kind in the country. So credit goes to Grant Sparks and our consultant partners at Kimley Horn on that, who will get that award in DC in June. And then we also got a national award for Virginia Breeze that I think I mentioned last month at the board meeting, and that was for our Virginia Breeze, a gift for Virginians social media campaign.
I
So
thought maybe they'd transport us to the Bristol meeting on Virginia Breeze.
we can make that happen if you'd like to ride.
Still wondering
So
why we're not doing that.
No.
we can make it happen. On the ridership front, all of our ridership is continuing to trend up year over year. We've seen some real positive movement in the DC metro area with both Metro and VRE over the past few months since the beginning of the year. Until we see, a return to the office from the federal government, I think that's going to continue to be a struggle. But
It's
I
gonna
know
languish.
DJ and team are working with VRE and our freight railroad partners to maybe look at some options to provide a little more flexibility. And when VRE is able to operate, we're doing some things with VRE from a marketing and promotion perspective. If you listen to the folks from Metro, their trips, and we kind of hit on this yesterday in the work session, that it's not just a commuting service anymore, that like Metro's peaks are like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, not morning and evening rush hours as they once were. And I think the more that we're able to adjust our services to meet that new travel paradigm, the better off we're going to be. And I think that's where we've seen success thus far, and we're seeing more success coming out at Metro and VRE.
I think we had a noteworthy event on the Metro system in the last month. After a 14-year hiatus, the system returned to automatic train control. So this is a system that was designed in the 60s and operationally started with automatic train control, and 14 years ago it was terminated. And it was manual operation for 14 years. So I guess kudos to Randy Clark. I'm assuming he was the initiator of that very sensible return to automatic train control.
We're also seeing the return of the 7000 series cars, a lot of movement on the fare evasion front, public
Some good
safety
things.
front, so lots of good things. Randy and our Virginia Metro board members, we had a legislative package that included some additional accountability measures for Metro, so we will have Randy and Paul Smedberg and Matt Letourneau address the board this fall, either September or October, and I think that will be helpful.
Good, very helpful.
Forward.
You comment on page 6, you referenced the DC to Charlotte corridor. Can you just give me
So the DC to Charlotte corridor is an application that we've done jointly with North Carolina DOT, and that's actually being done through VPRA. We acquired the S line, which runs between Petersburg and Ridgeway, North Carolina, as part of our CSX arrangement in the I-95 corridor, and so North Carolina has taken the lead on applying for funds, but we've already gotten over $50 million in preliminary engineering funding. So that's really the developmental corridor for Richmond to Raleigh.
It's to expand the service between Richmond and Raleigh.
Right, and it would be to bring the S line, which is technically it's an abandoned corridor. It would be to bring that corridor back into operation as a passenger
Jim,
rail
what's the
corridor.
best case earliest that you might see that happening? We're talking a decade, two
So
decades?
last week at the Southeast Rail Forum, I think North Carolina said 2026, but
No.
I'm sorry,
there's
2026.
they said 2026. DJ, have you got that is not
2026 is reasonable for them to add a couple hundred feet of service in the state of North Carolina.
in the state of North Carolina.
But for the whole corridor, and we're gonna do it in pieces, we're talking 2035, I think.
2035.
For the whole.
And this is for an existing rail corridor.
But no.
Well, I mean.
There are places where the corridor, where there are cuts that have been filled in with roadways built. I mean, it's a lot.
That's an extraordinarily
Yeah.
slow-moving process. Okay. Is that based principally on funding availability, or, because I can't imagine the complexity of that project are such that they couldn't be under construction in a year if they chose to. Is it really the funding that's limiting that?
I don't know that it's the the funding would speed it up, but the complexity of all the different landowners that are there that we're gonna be encroaching on, all the environmental work that has to be done, it's a corridor that existed.
Yeah, in 2006, I personally started the first EIS on that project, so we're already, 17 years into it, yeah.
It's
Jeez.
not just money.
All right, so I think we're ready to go on unless there's any more questions.
I've got one.
Okay.
Let's go back to VRE a minute.
Yep.
I read something that said the VRE is at about 40% of the ridership pre-COVID. Is that
Yeah.
generally correct?
Generally correct, yes.
Well, you know, I mean, I very much support VRE, the service that it provides, but that cannot go unresponded to indefinitely. Now, we can't make major funding decisions on short-term data. I fully embrace that notion. But what's the plan here?
So even at 40% of their pre-COVID ridership, DJ, correct me if I get off track on this. Even at 40%, VRE with 5 days of service a week is still carrying more passengers per week or more passengers per month than Amtrak Virginia, than our state-supported intercity passengers.
Much shorter distances.
Shorter distances, yes, but more passengers. So I mean, it's still impactful for congestion in the 95 and 66
I think
corridors.
that's the way you really have to think about it, Ray, is if VRE went away, those people still need to get to work, and they still need to get to work from Manassas and Spotsylvania and Fredericksburg. So their only alternative then is to get on 95 or to get on 66. And all of a sudden we go from reasonable, reliable, as we talked about yesterday, congestion, to totally unpredictability and awful congestion. So, I think that's, we did a lot of work to understand the role that rail could play in dealing with the congestion on those two corridors. Removing it would be a nightmare.
So we just went through a work stoppage at OmniRide, which is provides a lot of commuter bus out of Prince William County in the 95 corridor and the 66 corridor into DC. They had a union situation, a work stoppage that ended up lasting almost a month. And they went from commuter bus to no commuter bus overnight. And it was impactful to the interstate and to traffic, and it was very disruptive to commuters going to the Pentagon, going different places. So, I mean, I think it goes back to the need for a balanced, multimodal approach to looking at transportation. And I think when you take any one of these elements, whether it's commuter bus or VRE or Amtrak, and you look at it in a vacuum, you can't, you're missing how it plays into the bigger picture, and it takes those pieces. I mean, because we very easily and tried to say, okay, OmniRide's not there, take VRE. Well, a lot of those folks on OmniRide are going to the Pentagon, and VRE doesn't really get you to the Pentagon very, you can get there, but you gotta kind of work around a couple things. And so being able to provide options that you can rely on makes things better on 95. And the last 2 weeks, I've spent a lot of time on I-95. And every time I complain about congestion, the commissioner asks me why I'm not sitting on a train. And he's right. We can't lose sight of that. Even at 40%, it's impactful.
All right, last question for now. How much money is the Commonwealth spending on VRE annually?
We, on average, give them about $12 million a year in operating assistance and a little bit of capital. We are a drop in the bucket of their overall budget. I mean, that was part of the legislation that went through this General Assembly session. And when you look at their budget, which is hundreds of, I had the numbers down 2 months ago in the General Assembly, but we are a very, very small portion of their overall budget.
Where's the rest coming from?
It's kind
In
of
general.
Gas tax.
Regional gas tax from Northern Virginia, that's federal government, and then the local jurisdictions.
Localities all
Ticket
pay
sales?
also.
Ticket sales, and that's,
Ticket sales
they
were a good chunk of
they
their
were
revenue.
pre-pandemic. Their fare box recovery was very good.
No.
Until the Fed government decides to bring employees back to the office, those numbers are going to stay low.
That's for May. You got the date in May, and that date. You
Thank you.
explain on your slide 8, you talk about Virginia agencies, are those all the local bus services?
Those are
Excluding Breeze or including Breeze?
that does not include Breeze. That's all your local transit agencies. less VRE in WMATA. So that's, you know, your GRTC here in Richmond, Hampton Roads
So less
Transit,
WMATA,
Wintran up in your neighborhood.
Less VRE, less
WMATA.
WMATA, and less Breeze.
Breeze, we report separately
Yeah.
because that's intercity.
But it's not included in that.
It's not included in that.
Thank you.
And then Amtrak, I mean, best job ever is I get to every month say, and we broke a new record for the month of. DJ says he'll tell me when I can't say that anymore. So it does make it easy to continue to push for investment in rail when you look at the foundation of that program in integrated multimodal transportation planning, and you see the results coming out of just the beginnings of that investment in passenger rail with the increased ridership month over month, year over year. So we're heading in the right direction. All right, ready to move on? So now that we're done with the rail plan, what we plan to bring you are some policy conversations around our rail programs at DRPT. And we're going to start with rail industrial access. I know this is a program that everybody either love it or you don't love it, or you might love it sometimes and not love it other times. But what Mike's going to do today is kind of give you an overview of the program, how we got to where we are, and talk a little bit about what we're working on to potentially, over the course of the next few months, and as we reconvene this subcommittee this summer, potentially bring you some policy recommendations to consider for board policy. And then Mike, report. So the workshop starts at 10. Can you give it like 15, 20 minutes? 15 minutes?
Okay.
We have two other brief presentations to give you after the discussion on rail industrial access. We're working on the 6-year program. You'll get a full briefing on our recommendations next month, but we did want to give you for both transit and rail kind of where we are, like what we got, so that you have that stage set before we come to the board with a recommendation next month.
And colleagues, maybe we could just like make notes of where we want to ask the questions, let Mike run through the whole presentation and then circle back instead of stopping him, because I suspect a lot of our questions get answered further into his presentation. So otherwise we won't have time for everything we need to do.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I will run through a little quicker than we planned, just for the interest of time. So today what I wanted to do was actually take a little bit of a step back. I know that I've been in front of you most months at the workshops and action committee meetings with rail industrial access, but I wanted to take a step back and go through some of the background of the program, some of the decisions that got us to where we are today, and get everybody kind of on the same playing field. And then also talk a little bit about what we plan to do over the next several months. So essentially what we're going to undertake over the next 9-10 months or so is a review of the rail industrial access program. And this is something that we do for all of our grant programs at DRPT, transit, rail, and otherwise. Every once in a while we review our policies, we review our guidance, and we make updates as necessary, incorporate new policies and best practices. And so that's what we'll be doing today with the completion of the rail plan. We have some new kind of directives for the vision of rail, and so we want to incorporate that into the program. So we have already been doing some research, and so we're coming to you today to kind of give you some of the background information and kind of kick off the process. We will continue to do some research and kind of outreach to folks over the next few months, come back to you in June, and then bring some draft recommendations in September. If there are significant changes or policy type of changes that we incorporate into the guidance, we will then want to get that adopted by the full board. In some cases, we update our programs with kind of smaller administrative type of procedures, and those we don't necessarily need to get adopted by the full board. So one of the things that came out of the rail plan is developing and using data more comprehensively, using better data to make decisions. So I wanted to talk about some of the initiatives that we've been doing over the last few months. So just to kind of set the stage, for rail industrial access, the overall budget of the program comes out of the VDOT Construction Fund. It's $5.5 million a year. And that is something that we share with the VDOT Industrial Access Program. So similarly to Rail Industrial Access, VDOT gets applications from local governments to build essentially driveways or smaller roads into industrial sites. And so we share that fund with VDOT. For Rail Industrial Access, the maximum contribution that we will make is $450,000. That also requires a 30% match. So in order to receive that $450,000, you need to, the project cost needs to be at least about $650,000. Most of the projects we do, as you know, when I bring you some of the numbers, the budget numbers are far exceed that, but we do have that minimum 30% requirement. We get about, and for the last 5 or 6 years, we've gotten about 4 applications per year. Already in 2023, which isn't even over yet, we've already received 6. So we are getting kind of record numbers of applications. And over that 5 or 6 year period, we have essentially allocated about $8.5 million. And so somewhat similar to that VRE conversation, although I find these funds incredibly important and they absolutely support a ton of economic development in the state, this is a very small portion of the overall transportation budget. And kind of to that point, over that time period, we have essentially spurred $1.2 billion worth of development in Virginia, 99.9% of which is private investment. So that 0.1% is essentially that $8.5 million that we've contributed. The rest of it is private development for not only railroad infrastructure, but also for facilities, workplaces, manufacturing sites, et cetera. Along with that commitment of $8.5 million, we also get some performance out of it. In this case, we have a commitment of essentially 20,000 rail carloads, an increase of over 20,000 rail carloads across the rail network in Virginia, which translates to about 70,000 truck trips off of Virginia highways annually.
That's per year.
Yeah. The biggest initiative that we've done is digitize all of the projects in the program. So essentially, we've mapped out every single project that that Rail Industrial Access has contributed to. The first thing I want to note is that we have hit every single corner of this state over the years, which I think is a great testament to kind of the diversity of applicants that we get with the program. Secondarily, we've also digitized the components of every single one of those projects. So we can now map out the carload commitment, the number of jobs that have been created, the percent, of matching funds, was it in a designated economic development area, what year did we get the application. We also have we can break down the budget. We know how much the private investment was, how much the public investment was. So we have a ton of metrics that we can slice and dice in so many different ways. I didn't want to show all of those metrics here today because it would just take too long, but wanted to show that we've done this digitization, that we are hitting kind of every corner of the state, and we can really dive into this data in much more detail than we've been able to in the past.
I see several projects on the Eastern Shore, a rail line isn't that the one that's scheduled for abandonment or has been abandoned?
Yes, on the southern portion, that's true, although in the northern portion, the rail is still active.
So the two that are at the very north end of that are still active?
Well, those are, so in cases like that where if the rail infrastructure is pulled up or if it's no longer being used and they can't meet their carload performance, we actually claw back our funding. So if they were still actively under performance, we've gotten our money back. Next slide. And so the other thing that I wanted to note is even though we've done this recent digitization, which is a big step forward for kind of our data development, we have been providing data to kind of objective third parties over the years. And in this case that I wanted to highlight, JLARC does a review every year for incentive grant programs across the state. Rail Industrial Access has been included in that analysis and always performed very well. In this case, I just wanted to highlight that essentially they calculated what percentage of our capital investment goal did we actually meet with the program. And so not only are we scoring very high, 93, 98, in some cases over 100%, but we're also increasing year over year. And I think it speaks to kind of the efficacy of the actual day-to-day running and monitoring of the program. So having kind of dived into the data that we've been digesting over the last several months, I want to talk about the purpose of the program and sort of why we even have this program and support these types of projects. So the first thing that usually comes to mind when we talk about rail industrial access is essentially our connection to economic development and our connection to VDP. VDP has a pretty monumental task of essentially taking a world of possibility, a world of business opportunities, economic development opportunities, and funneling that to Virginia. And they have a ton of different incentive programs, tax breaks, other grant programs that are not within the Transportation Secretariat, but tons of incentives that they can kind of use to attract businesses. Rail industrial access is definitely one of those incentives. However, rail industrial access does not become fully applicable until the business actually contractually commits to Virginia. So this is not something that we can use in a speculative sort of way. The business has to be committed, then they apply for rail industrial access funds, and then it kind of almost takes a parallel route to the rest of the VDP's initiatives, where once we receive an application, it is then the Transportation Secretariat's kind of purview to evaluate and approve that funding. Then, as once approved, it kind of gets sucked back into that VDP kind of greater economic development initiative. We implement construction and then monitor the performance thereafter. So, although economic development is a big part of the program, it does kind of run on a bit of a parallel track to VDP. Next slide. And so, the true purpose that is outlined in the code, and this code, section was essentially created in the 80s, so it has been around for a while. The statement in the code notes that it is in the public interest that access railroad tracks and facilities be constructed, that they need to be available for use by all common carriers, and that the board should adopt procedures to encourage the widespread use of those funds. So those are the codified reasons for creating this program. And what that says to us, what we've taken from that is that the code really recognizes the benefit of investing in a multimodal network. When we have multiple choices for the businesses in Virginia, that creates competition, for how they ship their goods. When there are multiple choices, it creates resiliency. If one mode has, an incident or shuts down for some reason, those businesses can pivot and shift and, continue to do business despite, whatever might have happened. And so we find that choice and that redundancy creates resiliency for Virginia businesses. And then in general, I think, rail has some benefits over trucking. Per ton mile, rail is safer, has less emissions, reduces congestions on our highway by alleviating the need for additional trucks, and also can reduce costs because we don't have to pay for the maintenance of those facilities like we do on the highway. And so, noting that purpose, I want to go into how we've developed the program policies over the years. The way that we kind of do this is we take the code as sort of our baseline, kind of most informative information, couple that with lessons learned over the years and best practices, take your policy input, and we kind of combine all of those things, and that's how we create our guidance, that's how we manage the program day to day. And so first I wanted to highlight that, I kind of spoke to this before, but essentially the business needs to be under firm contract or already constructed in Virginia, and that the application for funds, so essentially the rail industrial application, has to be approved by the local governing body. And so this tells us that we need to ensure that the benefit is actually realized in Virginia. Again, it's not for speculation, and we require a resolution of support from the locality and also a letter of support from the railroad, essentially to ensure that the project is successful. We want to make sure that all the stakeholders that are involved are on board, they know about the project up front, and they are supportive to make sure that the implementation goes smoothly and that we realize the benefits in Virginia. Another policy that I wanted to note is that the property, so essentially the railroad tracks that we build, are, for the useful life of the project, are the property of the Commonwealth. And so what that means to us is that we need to safeguard that investment that Virginia has made with our public funding. First, our first policy is that it's a reimbursement-based program. So we do not spend any money until the business spends money. They will do the work, complete the work. We will go out and inspect the work, make sure that it was done in accordance with the application, and only then will we actually reimburse them for those costs. Second, we have a 15-year contingent interest. So in the example that Scott brought up, if the railroad tracks get pulled up for any reason, we will recoup a percentage of those funds. We also monitor performance, so anything that they, when they put in their commitments into the application, we ensure after the project is completed that they're meeting those commitments, and if not, we recoup our funding. And that goes to our kind of clawback provision, which essentially says, if you pull up the tracks, if you don't meet your performance, we get our money back. So it's less risk to Virginia. And then another policy that's kind of our most robust in terms of impacting the types of projects that we get are the way that we score all of the applications. And so where we get this in the code is the code notes that this program should speak to the volume of rail traffic, the capital investment, potential employment, and then other economic and public benefits. And so the way we interpret that is across multiple kind of objective data points that we can use to evaluate a diverse type of applications, and so that we can kind of compare and contrast fairly and bring those recommendations to you. So first, the code noted volume of traffic. That translates pretty closely to carloads. So essentially, how many new rail cars are we going to be moving as a result of this project? The code notes potential employment, so that translates to jobs. How many new jobs are going to be created? We find those to be kind of the core tenets of this program, essentially the contribution to the network and contribution to jobs. And so we have weighted those the highest amongst the scoring criteria in the application review process. The code also talks about capital investment. So we look at that in two different ways as well. We look at the percent that Virginia has in the total investment. So the total investment in this case means not only the construction of railroad facilities, but also in the business itself or in the land development. So this could be a total investment in expanding the footprint of the building so that they have more manufacturing space, expanding the footprint for storage and distribution, whatever it might be. But that's the total economic development investment in Virginia and our percentage. We also look specifically at the railroad construction itself. So we want to make sure that they're bringing money to the table for not just economic development, but also specifically for rail infrastructure. And the purpose of kind of looking at these two things, we essentially give more points to those projects where they've brought a higher commitment of private funds, which ensures the greatest leverage that we can of our, essentially we get the best bang for the buck of our public funding that we can. So the little bit more nebulous economic and public benefits, we've interpreted that in essentially three ways. First, we wanted to target high need areas across the state. So we look at two different metrics. One, we want to make sure that these sites are already designated economic development areas. That could be designated by VDP at the state level. It could be a regional authority or even just the local economic development initiatives. We just want to make sure that we are kind of communicating with our partners and that we are not disrupting local development plans. And then second, we also look at the local unemployment rate. And so we award more points for projects in areas that have a higher unemployment rate than the state average. And then finally, this is really more of a lessons learned for us. We provide an additional 10 points for projects that connect to the short line network. A lot of these rail industrial access projects, because of, to be fair, because of the $450,000 maximum, they are a little bit smaller projects that don't have the aggressive a number of carloads that a Class 1 railroad would need in order to be successful. And so our short lines in Virginia are Virginia businesses, they're smaller businesses, and they're very customer focused. And so that really ensures the success of these projects and makes sure, you know, that the investment is, you know, well utilized essentially. And so that gives us the total of 100 points, and we bring anything that scores above 50, we bring to you as our recommendation for approval. And so just kind of to summarize really briefly, you know, the codified purpose here is really to contribute capacity to a multimodal network that achieves our state goals. We want to, with our policies, we want to ensure that the benefit to Virginia is realized, where we safeguard our funds in multiple different ways, and we want to maximize the public funding with, you know, as much private match as we can. And then we've also developed a really objective, data-driven scoring evaluation tool that focuses really, for the most part, on carloads, jobs, and targeting high-need areas. So for us, the next steps is we're going to continue doing some of our best practice research. What we've done so far is look at other state programs around the country. We are actually going to do in-depth interviews with a handful of those states, kind of see what best practices they've learned for similar programs. And then we will come back to you with some of the results of that research and ultimately some draft recommendations for your consideration.
Mr. Merrill?
Thank you. Very
Nice
thorough.
job, Michael.
Two questions. One is a technical question, the other is a impact question. On the impact question, has this really made a difference? Because my impression is that 99.9% of the money is coming from private. They can do the deal anyhow. And do we have any data that shows that this program has caused a company to invest in rail that would have not under normal circumstances? Because if I look at the numbers, 99.9% is coming from private money. So to me, it's like, it's nice to give them $450,000, but has it changed any organization's decision as to whether or not to make that investment?
I'll tell you, I've applied for clients and received these every time. It's that extra tip. So when we're competing with plants in other states and we're going to do an expansion, it's just that little extra thing that says Virginia gets it as opposed to a facility in Pennsylvania or Alabama. But I agree with you. In the scheme of things, it's a whole lot of nothing because of the extensive costs, especially to build out for these unit train deals. It's incredible, massive work.
1.2 billion.
But it is kind of funny how big companies look at that and say, let's put it in Virginia because they want it.
So if people
No.
want to.
But that's,
The
testimonials are great.
yeah.
And the other, if I could just for a second, it also gives us that hook that keeps them committed to shipping by rail because of that longer term commitment that Mike referenced.
But they're going to do that anyway with what they've sunk in this thing. The only other point I would have following up on that, when you say target high needs areas, this is a discretionary interpretation of what the legislature meant by economic and public benefits. None of our projects have been in high unemployment areas. It's just the opposite, low, and they're building out even more. And I've always gotten approved, but that seems to hurt what we're doing.
We see a fair amount, maybe not in your area, but in other parts of the state where we see projects come in that are in a high unemployment area or in the area.
I mean, normally if you got to
recently.
put in that kind of money, you're really committed, you're robust, you're going to grow that much more. It kind of hurts the projects that I'm familiar with. I mean, we must score well on other places, so it doesn't matter.
Right.
But are there a lot of examples of this causes rail to be built in a high unemployment area?
Yeah, so it is, all of our scoring criteria are stratified, and so if the state average was, say, 5%, if the unemployment in the locality is 5.2%, you might not think of that as a super high unemployment area. However, it is higher than the state average, and so we give it some points.
So you get 20. Okay.
You may
But
not
it
get
would only
20.
be, yeah, it wouldn't be the maximum amount,
Okay.
it would be,
Okay.
you know, say 5 or 10 points. Something that is well above the state average would get that full 20. And having a stratified scoring criteria, we find to be helpful because, you know, you can get some points in an area that maybe aren't your strong suits, get higher points in other areas that are. And so the way that it has seemed to work out is those areas that are not high need have better numbers for carloads and job creations, which kind of drives their application score up. Those are that are in high need areas maybe have a little bit lower numbers for carloads and jobs, but because they're in a high need area, that kind of pushes up the application score. So it does tend to work out where, depending on the location and type of project, different metrics kind of, you know, go up and down.
So my technical question was on the capital investment portion of the formula. Is that a sliding scale on the private match? So if it's a 10 million, they get 5 points. If it's 20 million, they get 10 points, something like that.
It is, yes, it's a percentage. So, you know, if it's, for the total investment, we actually keep the numbers really low. So if it's like one, I have them, but they're in my bag. I have the actual stratification. It's, you know, if it's like 1% is publicly funded, they might get 5 points. If it's 2%, they get 10. If it's, you know, 3%, they get 15. And so it is stratified in that way. To, you know, again, to give some points for match and give as many points for the highest match that we can possibly get. And I do have that breakdown, which is, you know, published on our website and everything, which we can easily provide.
Mike, thank you for a very insightful presentation. I particularly like the look back and, if necessary, clawback provisions that ensure that the Commonwealth's investment is recognized. The amount of money here, as others have said, is next to nothing in the overall scheme of the budgets. But my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it has not increased for over 10 years.
That's right.
$5.5 million.
That's right.
But you have been able to fund all qualifying proposals. It's not like you run out of money. Is that correct or not?
That's correct. We haven't had a demand ceiling. That's correct. Yeah.
But, you know, let us know if you do.
Yeah.
We have to, since we share it with VDOT and
Right.
we have a cap on the maximum amount, we have kind of, I mean, if I'm being totally honest and maybe somewhat selfish, I would love to see a higher maximum per project. Because I do think that there are, the number one thing that we hear from most of the businesses is not necessarily would we do this project or not, it's how much would we invest in the rail network. And I think if we could give additional funding, you know, and an additional project maximum, they would be building out even more infrastructure on site so that they could drive those carload numbers up. For me, the benefit of this program is that we're able to, you know, we have statewide multimodal goals. You know, our goal is to have a multimodal network across the state. The more that we build out on the rail network, the better and stronger multimodal network we have. If we can do that for a minimal public investment, I mean, I think that we're doing really well as a, you know, a body that develops policy and implements projects.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, and I have some history working on the VDOT side of this program and that kind of interplay between the two agencies to share a source of funding. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the amount that the board policy for the road program
Yep.
has gone up.
Right.
Where this program has not gone up, and that
So
may
that's a
be.
board decision?
That was a
Increase
board,
that
that was
number?
board policy decision, it was increased on the roadside, so that may be something that we wanna look at
So we should
from a
increase
policy
to 450.
perspective. So you can increase from 450
with
to,
doing
and I
it.
can't remember what the road numbers are
That's
now,
all.
and they've
Problem.
changed, but that may be something, Dr. Smoot, to your point, that may be something that we can do if we've got the ability within that program to do that.
And the combination has not maxed out the 5.5 million in any particular year?
It's gotten close a few
No.
times, yeah.
I mean, I think that's really an important
Yeah.
data
We're only
point.
getting 4 applications a year.
Yeah.
We
No,
had,
but
what, 5
the-
applications in the second half of last year?
Yeah, for
5 or
some,
6,
I do think there was essentially over the, COVID pandemic period, there was some built up demand, and we have really been seeing that in this latter part of last year, we had 5 applications, which is more than our average in just about 6-month time period, and now we've already reached 6 and have, several more months to go.
And it doesn't roll over, so like if we don't spend it in a particular, if it's not allocated in a particular
It rolls.
year, there's $1 million left, does it move?
It
Does
rolls over.
Yes,
It does
it does,
roll over?
yeah.
Okay.
So that's why it should clarify, that's why I kind of sometimes hesitate to say how much, because with some rollover, I know that there have been years that we've spent more than 5.5, but we had some rollover from previous years, so it's a little bit hard to say exactly, have we been going over demand? We have in some years, but we haven't in others.
And then anytime there's a clawback, or if there's, on either side, whether it's the road or the rail side, if there's clawback where there's a project that doesn't move forward that was awarded funding, that funding goes back into the program as well. Mr. Pullman?
We have a very granular charts and data based on getting people on trains. Why can't we develop something that identifies freight in a way that, because you're earlier, you're getting 70,000 truckloads off the roads. Since we focus on getting trucks off the roads and more cargo on the rail, why can't we measure that? And I would say measure freight that is reasonable. That instead of taking coal, for instance, which is never going to go by truck, and other oversized, overweight pieces of equipment, but reasonable cargo that we can actually measure over time. Of real numbers of how we get trucks off the road and onto the rail, because I think that would allow some of us anyway to make recommendations that could maybe encourage people to move more to the rail rather than truck.
Yeah, definitely, and we do have we do have specific metrics about the network activity, and it's over time as well. So there is a data set that actually comes out of the federal waybill data.
Right.
It's digested by a company or a process called TransSearch, and we analyze that in the last rail plan and analyze it again in this rail plan so that we can see trends over time of what type of cargo is moving and where throughout the state.
Sure.
And then we also have essentially it's an Info USA data that is essentially the location of all of our businesses and the type of industry that it's in. And so we've been able to analyze industries that are the type of industry is conducive to moving by rail. So bulk commodity products, agriculture, stuff like that. That are near a rail line but don't have direct access to a rail line. And those are ones that we can kind of target for, essentially the question of why aren't you moving by rail today? Why haven't you wanted to connect directly to the rail line, and start working to develop those more?
Can we start developing?
So we look at that data on an annual basis, where we get the transit data that we report to you is all data that is reported to us on a monthly basis. We can
Right.
bring that to you each month, but we do, the rail data gets published in our annual report.
Okay, so it's annually.
We've had lots of conversations about how we do that in the form of this director's report, but that is an annual data set.
I would encourage you all to consider economic upturns and downturns, because that has a lot to do with, you might get skewed when you say, 20,000 car loads, but in a downturn that may be 10,000. Well, that doesn't look so good, but as compared to the amount of truck traffic that it may be moving at the time, and those two need to be compared.
Yep.
As a percentage.
So,
Definitely.
this has been a fantastic conversation. Great job, Mike. We have 2 more presentations to get through and probably about 15 minutes to do that. Mike and Emily are always available if you want to have them take a deeper dive and go into more detail and talk about the programs. I would encourage you to reach out to either one of them, and we can set up a one-on-one. So we'll be back with more on this when we have our next subcommittee meeting in June.
Thank you all very much.
You said the yearly, when is that?
We publish our annual report in November,
Okay.
October, November. That's
Can I
essential.
get a copy of the list?
We handed them out last October, but I can send it to
Okay.
you.
All right.
They weren't here.
The new
Were you?
people?
No, I think so.
They weren't here.
Were you here?
Oh, yeah,
You were here in
I guess we were.
October.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
right.
we were in,
Maybe.
yeah.
We'll
get it
up
to
in
you.
Newfoundland.
And I have some ideas about how to show that
I
spatially.
think
that
I've
we
been
can go
here.
through.
I've been here every meeting.
Yeah. We'll make sure we
I
get it.
sacrificed my life for this.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
you heard the secretary yesterday. I work 24/7, and I feel like I've sacrificed my life for this as well. Okay. All right, so Emily's going to give us an update on so we take in applications for those of you that are going through this full cycle for the first time. We take in applications for both our rail and transit programs once a year. We open our cycle the 1st of December. Applications are due February 1st. So what Emily and Zach are going to do is just give you kind of a look into what we got in terms of applications. Next month, they'll come back and present, like after we've gone through our evaluation and prioritization programs or processes, which are all established by CTB policy, what the recommendation is for funding projects. But we want to give you at least a look today to see what we got.
Quick question, the applications from jurisdictions for rail,
Mm-hmm. They're
Is that
from the
what this is?
railroads.
And from the
From the railroads.
from the railroads?
And this is, RIA has an open application
Different
process.
than the
This
rail
is
industrial, from the
rail
railroad.
preservation and freight.
Got it.
Right. Okay, we can move ahead with the next slide. So these are the two programs. We have 3 rail programs that Mike's team oversees, the freight rail grant program and the rail preservation, and then rail industrial access that you just heard about from Mike. So we have these 2 grants to focus on today that go through the process that Jen just described every year. The freight program, which comes out of the Commonwealth Rail Fund, has about $12 million annually, tied to state revenues since it comes from the Commonwealth Rail Fund. It's the source of the money for the freight program, and then the purpose of the program is to fund capacity improvements. These are larger projects, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about that. Rail preservation is meant to fund state of good repair projects for short line railroads that provide that last mile service. About $8 million maximum per year. Part of that comes from the appropriations bill, and then there's also the opportunity to transfer money from the Commonwealth Rail Fund to help with those projects as well, depending on the application level every year. Next slide. So this is the summary of the applications that we got this year. So our FY24 applications, we got 4 applications for the freight program. We got 16 applications from short line railroads for rail preservation, for a total of the request and the anticipated state match of over $45 million. So that's the application pool. It's not necessarily what we're recommending. We would love to be able to recommend all of them, and but that's a snapshot of what we got this year. Now, what
31
we're
million is requested from the state.
Pardon me?
31 million is being requested from the state, or the 14 million is being requested?
It's the 14.3 would be requested from the state. The 31 million is, oh, sorry, other way around.
Yeah.
31 million is what's
Yes,
requested
yes.
from the state.
Well,
Potentially
and they're
$20
gonna
million
pay.
Right. Right.
overall.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What is rail preservation?
So the rail preservation grant is meant to help with state of good repair projects for short line railroads.
It's exactly as it's stated. I just want to make sure that the words
Sure.
match what the intent was.
You know, we were told, well, this may have been a one-off conversation when we took that trip last summer through the Afton Tunnel.
Yep.
Yeah.
And those ties in the Afton Tunnel had been there since World War II.
And they're being replaced with
And they're
rail
being-
preservation funds.
Right, they're being replaced. That was cited as one of the projects
Yes.
that maintenance for the short lines particularly.
Yeah,
supported.
and Buckingham Branch in particular has has applied, and they've been very successful with the rail preservation program, but then they're leveraging what they're getting from us to go ask for federal CRISI money to do even more of that work. And so that's where we can kind of layer these projects in and go get more funding from the feds now that the federal rail program has grown so much under IIJA.
Next slide. So this is what we are recommending for each program. The freight program is on the left-hand side, the rail preservation program is on the right-hand side, and for the rail, I'll start on the right-hand side. For rail preservation, we have a mandatory 70-30 split, and we are recommending a program projects for FY24 at $15.2 million, and we, based on the funding constraint that we have and the scoring criteria ranking, then there was one high priority project for each railroad that applied. So 8 of the railroads, 8 of the 9 short line railroads applied, and we have one high priority project from 8 of those railroads. And the 15.2 will be spent over time as multi-year projects move forward. And then on the freight side, our scoring criteria for this program is really aimed at increasing the match percentage, so the percentage of private investment. And so we look at a higher level of design for these projects and a higher level of match to get the project quality that we're looking for. And so for this year, we're recommending $6.8 million based on funding availability and the scoring criteria. And so the private match is in the darker color, the DRPT amount is in the lighter color on the bottom. So for the next slide,
And those numbers are total cost?
correct. And so our application summary, just to give you a flavor of the types of projects that came through on the freight project side. These are, there are 4 different projects that we're recommending for funding. Coming from the Port Authority, coming from the Buckingham Branch Railroad, Shenandoah Valley Railroad, and also Cathcart out of Lynchburg, which actually builds rolling stock, which is a little different for us. But there's a diverse group of applicants, as you can see, diverse geographic location, which is what we were hoping for. And then on the rail preservation side, the request was $39 million. We are recommending an award total of $15 million, as I mentioned, and so 8 out of the 16 grants that we got are being recommended here. So it's a really popular program, as you can tell, and there's more demand than we can fund out of it.
So the class 1s don't apply under the freight, or do
They
they?
do.
We
They can.
class one
Yes.
up?
So these are the applications that we got for this
Okay.
year. Correct. So that is my summary, and I can turn things over to transit unless you all have questions.
All right. Thanks, Emily.
Okay, sure.
So Zach's up. This will be his first. Y'all go easy on him. This is his first. This is his first formal CTB appearance before next month. You'll see him present 6-year program next month. But Zach joined us back in October.
Are you still visiting?
I still hardly know where the bathroom is.
We need to get him a VDOT badge.
Need to get you a name tag here.
Well,
So out now, say how you doing? Don't know. So yeah, we'll run through this quickly. Just again, as the director mentioned, you all only see this once a year. So we wanted to take an opportunity to give you a little bit of insight before you see something next month about the process we go through to develop the transit portion of the 6-year improvement program that is our guide for what we say we're going to do over the next fiscal year. So, which is fastly approaching. Mary Olivia, the next slide. So the name of our program for allocating the funding that comes through the Commonwealth is called MERIT, and that is the acronym for Making Efficient Responsible Investments in Transit. And so the fiscal year 24 cycle that's upcoming is the 5th year of the program. It officially took effect on July 1st, 2019. So it did replace a former process for funding that was replaced for a lot of reasons, I think, that came through you all and everybody else. So it is a process that we use for allocating that funding, both operating, capital, and some other funding to our transit partners. And all that is through statute 33.2, so it breaks it up into various, comes through the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund, it comes through that larger funnel of funding. So it's been a great program thus far in these various cycles. So the next one. So you can see that this is the amount of funding that we are operating with, that we're dealing with this year. So obviously, I will tell you that as a former agency head myself, operating costs are really such a huge driver for transit agencies. You have salaries, maintenance. I mean, it can be up to more than 70% of an agency's cost. So that is where we do offer a pretty good amount of funding there for operating costs especially. We do have a 30% cap, which I'll talk about in a second, that seems to work well for us, providing some help to agencies, but not also expecting them to have a lot of proverbial skin in the game. So next one. So the operating allocations are, we do have a performance-based program, and as you can see there, these are, I guess you could say, a little bit input and output based. There's some things that we expect the agency to be able to show us in terms of their effort and in terms of operating costs and what they're putting towards it. But we also expect some of those outputs that they're getting the mileage per se, out of our money that we'd like to see them get, so we can make those funding decisions and make sure. One of our values of the RPT is stewardship. So and certainly all across the Commonwealth. So we're using that funding well. So again, the projected fiscal year 24 is 132 million. As I just mentioned, we do have a 30% cap that agencies can go up to, and again, we don't want it to be a blank check, but it also still provides a significant amount of funding. And I'll talk about that later, about our great partnership with our agencies. So next one. So operating, as I said, is a big part of it. Capital prioritization. As you all know, transportation overall is a very capital intensive industry, and that goes for the transit side as well. In line with basic federal guidance, we take a lot of prompts from. State of good repair is our biggest priority. I think we learned a long time ago in transportation, you can't just build new. You can't keep continuing to build new forever. You have to maintain what you have, and so transit's taken that tact as well. We can't run buses but for so long, and we've all gotten better at making sure we replace them in a timely manner, so we're not spending significant amounts on maintenance versus that could be going towards other costs. So then also minor enhancements and major expansions. So those are other things that we do allow. We do provide some significant capital for new purses and things like that, though, through through those programs as well. So we'll look at a couple of the metrics in just a second. So next slide. So for the state of good repair, which we said gets our largest share of funding, and it's made that way. These are just some of the just so you can look at these later a little more closely. But certainly we have to keep up state of good repair. Where is that asset in terms of its useful life? I mean, we have a transit asset management process that we have agencies go through to apply for these things. Now this year we have added, or I don't know, it might have been last year. I don't know, we recently added an incentive score just to provide a little bit for good applications, sort of innovation, maybe goals we have in terms of zero emission, equity, things like that. We can give some additional incentive to that. So that's really the only carrot we have in a way. We incentivize agencies to do things. We don't necessarily mandate things. So these are just the tools we have to use.
Okay.
Mary Lou, the next one.
And if I can just jump in really quickly,
Sure.
all of these, what you see on these slides is all in CTB policy. And those CTB policies, by code, we have a Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee that helps us make a recommendation to the board, and Dr. Smoot is our bridge. He serves on the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee in one of the DRPT appointed slots. So we look at this process every year for improvement, and we went through a a full cycle update. So these are changes that are just being implemented that the board adopted last October. Yeah, thank you, Grant.
So again, one of our values at the RPT is innovation, and so we're always trying to innovate this process. Can I talk about the values, or is this
Yeah.
still locked up in our drawer?
You'll see it. I will hand you our new strategic plan next month, but we
So
have.
I'm going to give you a preview.
You are giving a preview. Go ahead.
So minor enhancement, that's where we do give some, things to buy, so they can buy things, buy new things, but not necessarily major expansion type of level. So maybe look at the next one. This is where.
Zach, is there a match on minor enhancements?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that matches can vary, but yes, so most all these things. So, good question. Actually, the code requires that there is a local match, basically. So it's not operating, but it's all these things. So
The state share on state of good repair and minor is 68%,
Right.
and the state share on major expansion is 50%.
So yeah, those are the common ones. So major expansions, we did base some of these factors on the very, how would I say this, the very thoroughly vetted smart scale process at the time. So that's how we also did these major expansion things. I know that's all being discussed now, but this has worked pretty well for us for major expansion at this point. But again, we're always reviewing these things as well. So again, that's what you'll see. This is how we're developing our recommendations when it comes to the 6-year improvement program. So here's just some of the data about what we received in requests this year. So we did have over 136 million in capital applications. I won't refer back to the other slide, but it's, you're usually going to get more requests than you get actual money that you have. That's nothing new in terms of grant making and government. So, but thankfully, again, we prioritize state of good repair, so that is why we get the most applications for that. This is kind of in line. Applications are going up every year. We've given you, I think, some historical data and various other things, but they're still in line with what we've been getting historically over the last 4 years this program's been in operation. So.
Relative to the availability of funds, that's pretty close.
It's
not like
yes.
smart scale where you
Right.
get orders
But
of
yes,
magnitude.
it's completely out of scale. No, that's why this program has worked well. I think the way that it flows through the transit funding has been a great program thus far. It's provided the right amount of resources.
And that really became a reality as a result of some work that happened in 2018, because we did have what was coined a capital fiscal cliff that was looming, a big state of good repair backlog. The 2020 Transportation Omnibus Bill fixed kind of the funding percentages and the formulas that have given some stability to the program. When you layer in the amount of COVID relief funding that we got that came through DRPT and that we allocated through the merit program for the rural agencies that paid for 100% of capital for a year, almost 2, that has really enabled us to shore up the program, clear out a bunch of backlog from a funding perspective. We still have a state of good repair backlog from an implementation perspective because we just can't get the assets that we have allocated funding to, but it will catch up. So we're in a much better position than we were 5 years ago, which is why this program came into effect. I mean, it was accountability for the funding.
And it's a partnership, so agencies also know, like, hey, we can't ask for this. We need to keep our ask at a certain.
Well, and the other piece I feel like we added was that everybody had to have some kind of a strategic
Yes.
plan that incorporated the asset conditions,
Yes.
so that we had more insight into sort of where the blips and ups were, right?
We are able to do long-range capital forecast. So we do a short range, a 5-year capital forecast you'll see in the final 6-year program. But yes, we're able to get a 10-year view, and so we can see where the capital programs are lumpy, and so the funding's not. So you've got to be able to kind of knock off those peaks by carrying over funding in years where you don't need as much, and so we've been able to effectively do that because of that
helps
requirement.
the local agencies too, to know that this is in your view, so that there's a greater chance that they'll be able to get that money.
Great point, thank you, man.
Predictability and consistency has been a real advantage. So the special programs is where we get to have our fun. Again, it's not the main source of funding. It's a smaller percentage of what ultimately comes out, but it's where we get to, we were talking about innovation, which is a real key word for us. This is where we get to deal with the studies and the things that are really looking towards the future, the studies, the demonstration programs, our commuter assistance program that's still a growing part of transit to reduce the environmental impact of commuting via single occupancy vehicles. So that the technology is just really increasing how those programs are run. Workforce development is something that's so key nowadays because we're changing that from an intern program because we do want to focus on not just necessarily white collar jobs in some ways, but also there's just a real struggle right now in the workforce across every sector of it to get folks. So if we can help in that, it's certainly our duty to do so. And the Transit Ridership Incentive Program is something that keeps coming into its own. It's only been around for a relatively short period of time. You can see there that it was created legislatively with some goals to include regional connectivity, integrated fare collection, and reduce zero. As it says, this is to increase ridership, and again, sort of through the fare, it takes away the inconvenience potentially of having to buy a ticket here, buy a ticket there. And so I think that's an area that's going to really, you'll see some great innovation in and increase in use of to be able to go regionally across jurisdictions without having to have cash or something like that, and which would be a tremendous, we think, incentive to ridership as well.
There was legislation related to this program that went through the General Assembly this year that you'll hear about in the legislative update today. So, but we do anticipate doing another mid-cycle application period for this program this fall. So we'll be bringing you some policy changes for this later this
A lot
year.
of great ideas are going to be coming out of this program this year. Okay. So, I guess to conclude, I'll say, DRPT, we have a very close relationship with our transit partners, and we think it is somewhat unique. We do provide that operating assistance and that significant capital assistance. And the lady yesterday in the V-Trans, Hannah, she was talking about how the CTB itself is such a unique entity for a state, and so we feel like DRPT is also, something that has a great partnership, and we really are able to work closely with our transit partners at the local level, and so it really fosters that shared sense of mission, and so we appreciate y'all's support in doing that as well. So.
Any questions for Zach?
Two quick questions.
Mhm.
Does the CTB approve these allocations, or is that just a staff allocation approval?
They approved the 6-year improvement program.
So we'll make a staff recommendation that'll come out next month that
Individual projects.
to individual projects. And then that will be subject to the public hearings around the state, and it'll come back to you in June for an approval.
And my second question is, what is revenue vehicle hour or revenue vehicle mile?
It's just when something is actually in service, picking up customers, for instance, because I guess that's opposed to what they call deadhead miles, when you're going to, you're leaving the depot and you're going to where you're going.
So when they're charging passengers.
Exactly, when you're actually in service, you're in.
New term.
It's
term called revenue
They
service,
might be
yeah.
charging.
Yeah, there's a whole
It's when you're in
industry
revenue service,
terminology.
yeah, you're actually like, you see something says out of service, they're not revenue service
Yeah.
at that time.
Dr. Smith, you have a
So,
question?
Zach, this 300 million or so total is spread across how many local agencies?
We have 39 basically like urban, I guess, agencies that we give this operating assistance to, and then we have a number of rural and human service agencies. So it's a big, but yeah, 39 is basically what we
There's
provide.
really not a lot of money for any one agency, some more than others, but.
We've got a handful of really big agencies and then a
And
bunch
most
of
of them
really
are
small.
out across the Commonwealth.
Like I said, it provides a good amount, but it's not anything they don't have to still, have local support and put their own stuff in. So it's good partnership.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, so
Very
I
good.
Yeah.
think that brings us to a close. We'll reconvene the subcommittee in June. It's just too much when we're traveling to do that. If you can leave the notebooks, then Sheila will bring them back in June. But thanks
Thank you
everybody.
guys, good meeting.
Good report.